And and I recently graduated from Seattle University with my doctorate in ministry degree in this particular area, congregational adaptive change. And so I'm excited to share not just some of my insights, but to start the conversations in your own congregations. So as we begin, I want to invite everyone to mute themselves. You can keep your video on if you'd like to, but it's not necessary at this moment. But if you can mute yourself, that will help us to not have feedback or hear your dog or your bird or I left my home, so you won't hear my small children, but any of those other things that might be distractions. And I want to invite you to join me in a word of prayer. This prayer comes from, I think it comes from the Book of Common Worship, which is the Presbyterian book, but it's available in a lot of different sources. And I think it's an excellent prayer that summarizes adaptive change, actually. So join me in prayer. Eternal God, you call us to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths as yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us faith to go forward with courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supporting us. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I want to just say a word about how we engage with one another in this format. For some of you, Zoom may be old hat. For some of you, it may be still relatively new. If it feels new, you are in an adaptive moment. So pay attention to that. So if we can stay muted most of the time, we will have some time in breakout groups this morning for sure. But I want to make sure that we're staying as present as we can. So if you have another device near you, this may be more of a Gen X or millennial problem. Put your other devices away or turn them to silent notification or something like that. To listen generously and to not engage in fixing or advice giving. We want to try to avoid that. And one of my principles for dialogue is always, when the going gets tough, turn to wonder, right? Instead of what's that person's problem? It's like, why am I having such a reaction to that? Okay, so turn to wondering instead of, I don't think we're going to have really hard conversations, but it's something to keep in mind when you take this back to your own organization, that you will be engaging in hard conversations. So hold on to that wonder. And then always just speak for yourself. Try to use I statements or my congregation instead of universalizing experience. I think that's just always better. And we know where you're coming from. And just maybe to welcome some discomfort today. You might hear me say some things you're like, oh, I don't know if that's true. That's fine. Just welcome that. You know, we might get into some places where we feel uncomfortable today. So all that being said, I'm going to share my screen. I want to lay out a little bit how we're going to proceed today. So we're going to have some gathering time here this initially. We're going to break you into a small group just for a few minutes to talk about one thing and to get to know each other a little. And then we're going to spend the morning really talking about what is adaptive change? What's an adaptive challenge? How do we know? How is it different from technical problems? And we'll get into some examples, and we'll have another breakout group for you to talk about how you've experienced both of those things a little bit and to share back with the group. And then we'll have a nice long break for lunch. I would encourage you to get up, move around, breathe some fresh air, eat something healthy, all of those things. When we come back in the afternoon, we're going to talk about adaptive leadership, how that is maybe different than some ways you've thought about leadership before. And then I'm going to give you a couple of tools that you can take and use in your congregation right away. Okay, so after, like Sandy said, you'll be able to come back to this recording. I'm also going to send you an annotated resource list and a PDF of the PowerPoints and places where you can write. So that will be coming to you hopefully within the next 48 hours. So that if you do go back to this material, you have a place where you can kind of keep all of your notes and thoughts and things like that. Okay, hopefully that sounds good. Hopefully that's what you signed up for. I see people giving me the thumbs up. I do want to say too, I see a few names of people. I won't call them out because they are anonymous in my research, but that did participate in my research project a couple of years ago. So thank you, thank you, thank you. You were part of bringing this actually to fruition, even though you didn't know it and I didn't know it at the time. But thank you so much for that. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll get into the process here. So as a way of welcome, I want to ask you, why are you here? Now, this also helps me to see or to try to make sure that I'm getting to what you want to talk about as well. Okay, so in the chat, don't turn on your microphone. In the chat, if you can just say a word, what are you hoping for? Why are you here? Is your congregation in crisis? Are you just wanting to learn? Anything like that. And I'm going to open my chat and I'm just going to read some of those out as they come in. So why did you sign up for this? I doubt you're all just super bored on Saturday for 4 hours. Yes, Jennifer, I will include the prayer. I have to stay on top of the chat or it will go out. I guess we can save the chat though too, can't we, Sandy? Okay. A new region equals an adaptive moment, that's for sure. Want to be a better leader. Working with new partnerships, that's wonderful. Inspiration to share with your steering team, great. Better at helping people. Hoping for tools and guidance, awesome. Yeah, Jennifer, you nailed it. I was going to talk about this too, but we've known for a long time the church is in a season of change, right? And many of us don't feel equipped to meet that moment. Learning in a new environment, awesome. Right, I'm so happy to see my Kirkland Interfaith Network people here. They're in a season of change. I think when we get focused on our congregations, but our sort of para-church organizations are going through some change as well. To learn, our church is not thriving. Support and awareness of change is going on. Good. Learn how to be a leader for these times, right? You know, in some of my research and reading, many pastors and congregational leaders feel ill-equipped to meet the particular challenges of this time, particularly if we're 10 or more years out of seminary, which didn't really prepare us in some cases for meeting adaptive challenges. So I know in my congregational leadership class, we talked a lot about technical problems, but not so much about adaptive change. So very good. Well, welcome, welcome, welcome to all of you. I hope that this meets your needs as well. So this is one of my favorite cartoons about change, right? Anybody felt this way? Who wants to change? Everybody. Yeah. So I want to send you into a breakout room for Sandy. Can we do groups of 4? Will that work? Okay, because I won't be in one, right? Or I don't want to be in one necessarily. So how do you think about change? And just 2 minutes, right? 2 minutes each. Talk about, boy, when I'm faced with a change, here's how I feel, here's what I think. Not so much describing any particular change, just change in general. How do you think about it? Assign, we don't really need to assign a timekeeper, I guess, because they'll get a warning at a minute before it's time to come back. But just pay attention to how long you're talking, so don't take any more than 2 minutes. And then when you come back, I want you to share something in the chat about what you heard that surprised you or what deeply resonated with you about change in particular, okay? All right, Sandy, I can see is setting that up as we speak. I know what it looks like on the screen to set up a breakout group. So
yeah, I think we're ready. Kara, you're going to get an invite to a room. Just don't go.
okay, I just want to go. All right. So when you see the invitation to join a room, just click on it and you'll go right there. There it is. Join your room, and I'll see you in about 7 or 8 minutes.
I can't see the full screen. Do you want to stop sharing your screen and
Yep.
then? Oh.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to go back to my, whoops.
Yes.
So if you, as you're coming back, if you want to add something to the chat about something you heard that surprised you, or something maybe that resonated through your whole group about how we think about change, that would be great. I'm going to go and take a look there.
I got it. And then do remute yourself after you.
Yes. Okay, as you're coming back, share something in the chat that you heard that surprised you, or that maybe resonated with your whole group. Toby, I'm going to address your question. So those of you who are from different churches, what the region we're talking about is the region of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And it is the way that we structure things is through this region idea. And our region covers Montana, North Idaho, although I don't think we have churches there right now, Washington, and Alaska. So that's sort of the geographic area that we're talking about. Recently, the Northwest region, which was Washington, Alaska, and the Montana region merged to form a new region. So that's what we're talking about. Good question. Thank you. Try to be mindful that there are non-disciples here.
Yeah. Well, and thank you very much. Could you say how many disciples congregations there are in the new region? Do you know?
Yeah, Sandy, I don't know the number.
Yes, there are 52-ish. Some are more connected than others, but about 52 congregations. And we actually do have 2 in North Idaho.
Oh, we do. Okay. And we are, we're a congregational polity, so the region is not the authority on things. The region is more of an alongside kind of structure. Okay, so let's talk about change. We have multiple challenges and can't work on all of them at once. That is true. We reflected on the difference between change that happens to us against our will. Okay. Doing one small thing can be empowering and can make a difference. I often think others are like me, not liking change, but that's not true. Embrace change. Fighting it only makes it harder. Identifying the difference between adaptive and technical. Little changes help with bigger changes. Yep. Change is an opportunity for growth. Change we initiate. Okay, thank you for that clarification, Rosemary. Sometimes it's difficult to embrace change. Yes, it is. Okay, technical, adaptive, respectful communication. Awesome. We're going to talk about that. Prayer, listening, and study. Oh boy, being able to anticipate, prepare for change does make it easier. It does. That does not always happen, right? Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Hopefully you're starting to build a little connection with some other folks in here. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen with one of my very favorite cartoons. This is from a cartoonist he calls himself the Naked Pastor. I don't know anything about where that came from, but that's what he calls himself. And this verse from Isaiah, right? Many of us are very familiar with this. Behold, I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? Right? So why adaptive change? Well, So I believe, like the Bible tells us in many places, that God and the Spirit in particular are inviting us into new things. And in some ways, in the church, and maybe even sort of para-church organizations, we've attributed our adaptive challenges and the changes we see happening in church to the culture out there, right? Those darn soccer leagues that are having their practices when we used to do church, or more people working on the weekends, or whatever other social changes might be happening. We sense this decline, right, in our own organization around resources and participation and even sort of social influence, right? Or missional influence, what we used to be able to do, we're not able to do anymore. And so I think that realization invites us into the adaptive moment to say, wait, what if the Spirit is part of what's happening here? Maybe the Spirit is moving us into something else, like she pushed Jesus right out into the wilderness. God leading the people into the desert. I think one of the greatest adaptive stories in the Bible is Moses at the Red Sea, right? Where do we go now? Is that question that we ask ourselves. And so today we're going to talk about adaptive change. We're going to talk about the difference between adaptive change and technical problems. We're going to talk about what makes for a community that is built to change rather than built to last. I think that's a significant shift in the way we think about church. We're going to talk about adaptive leadership and the particular challenges of leadership versus authority. And I'm going to share some stories from my own congregation and some resources for you as well. Right. So let's just dive right in. Technical problems are easier to talk about. So we're going to start there. A technical problem is easy to identify. Technical problems often lend themselves to quick and concrete solutions. Technical problems often can be solved by an authority or an expert. People are generally receptive to technical solutions. And technical solutions can often be implemented quickly, even by decree. That means this is what we're going to change and we're going to do it, and there's no conversation about it, okay? The metaphor for a technical problem is sort of dry high ground, right? So from my own experience, well, I'll talk about my own experience in a second. So that's what a technical problem is. An adaptive challenge, on the other hand, is difficult to identify and easy to deny, right? You can't deny the toilet is plugged, right? That's a technical problem. An adaptive challenge is a bit more nebulous in nature, ambiguous in nature. Adaptive challenges, people with the adaptive problem, have to be the ones that work on solving the problem, right? You can't necessarily bring someone in from the outside and have them wave their wand and fix the challenge. It has to be done by the people in the organization. Adaptive challenges may require, and most often do require, changes in values, beliefs, particular roles or relationships, and our approach to maybe even the process of how we go about making change in our organization. Maybe not all of those, but it is going to be rooted in that somewhere. Adaptive challenge requires change in numerous places, usually across organizational boundaries. So if you have an adaptive change, it's not just going to be your worship committee that has to meet that challenge. It's going to be the worship committee with the elders, with the pastor, with your musicians, with whatever. It's going to be, it's going to move across those particular kinds of boundaries. And if it's an adaptive challenge that is related to your community, then it's going to reach across the boundaries of just our church organization into city council, into any kind of resource center or the local school, whatever that might be. People often resist acknowledging adaptive challenges. we'll talk more about that. Solutions require new learning, new discoveries, and almost always experimentation. Adaptive challenges can take a long time to sort through and to implement change. So there has to be sustained energy in the organization for meeting an adaptive challenge. And so the metaphor for adaptive challenge is the swamp, right? In a swamp, you have to test the footing first. You don't have a straight line through it typically, right? You might have some sense of an end goal, but how you're going to get there is mostly unknown. Okay. So any questions or clarifications about those before I move on? And you can just unmute yourself or whatever instead of using the chat if anyone has a question. Okay, I don't see any. Is there anything in the chat, Sandy? No.
Sorry, I was muted. No.
Okay.
Laura Robinson just unmuted.
I always benefit for examples of each kind of thing that you're talking about. So could you go back and give some examples of
that's where I'm going next. That's where I'm going next.
Okay, awesome. Great.
Okay. Perfect timing. All right, we'll just go to the examples and then maybe we can fish around there. Now, before I move on, there was one more click. There can be technical aspects to adaptive challenges, right? Typically, adaptive action is going to be a mix of these things, and there might be technical pieces that can be fixed quickly and easily. That's always nice when that happens, actually. Okay, so examples. Technical problem. These are from my church. We had a broken sewer line, okay? Easy to identify because there was water in the lower level. Problem, right? There was a quick and concrete solution. So what did I have to do? I was the only one in the building. I had to call my board member who handles building issues. I call the secretary because she's the one who can write a check really quick if we need to. And I call the two people in the congregation I know have wet dry vacs. All right, boom, boom, boom. I didn't have to get a committee to decide that. We didn't have to study it. We just did it, okay? It was solved by experts. I do not know how to repair a sewer line, so we called in an expert and they did the work, okay? People easily agreed on the solution, right? It was actually our board chair for the building that connected with I guess they're a plumber. I don't even know. See, here's how much I know about it. The company that came and fixed everything, and we all agreed that that was the solution that we needed, right? It was implemented by decree. The only thing we needed board approval for was writing the check because it was a big check, and we just sent an email and everyone agreed, right? So it was pretty much, here's what we're doing and here's how we're doing it. We did not have access to our building for a week. And so I called our church friends, our UCC friends down the street and said, can we come and worship with you on Sunday? They invited us. We already had a relationship with that church. So many of us went there. And this was a few years ago before we were doing online church. So, so we went and worshiped there, problem solved, back in the building. Okay, that's a technical problem. Now, it's not easy or simple necessarily. It costs a lot of money. There were decisions that had to be made, but it didn't take long, right? We got all that done in a week and then just moved on with life, okay? Now, adaptive challenge. One of the adaptive challenges we recently navigated through was changing our affirmation of faith. Now, for some of you, this might not seem like a big deal. It's like, well, the pastor just picks a new one out of the hymnal. That would be a technical problem, right? But for us, it was a deeper issue than that. So over time, it was difficult to identify and easy to deny. So here's what I mean by that. Over time, I had heard from a couple of people, friends of mine who had been in church, who had commented like, your affirmation is kind of off-putting. Have having it right before communion feels like it's a gateway, right? These are thoughtful people that I trust. Somebody else in the congregation came to me and said, is there any chance we could change that? It just feels kind of not really our theology. And so it was over the course of many months that I noticed these comments coming in from different places. All right. So I just started to pay attention to that. Now, the people in the congregation who either didn't mind or embraced the affirmation we had, there's no problem for them, right? It's easy to deny. And some of the people who had commented on it were what we would call guests, or you might call visitors in the congregation. And so, you know, easy to not pay attention to. So what did we have to do? We had to identify root causes and look systemically, right? Who are the people that are bringing this to my attention? I had to do some research, right? How long has this church been using this affirmation? Is there a particular theological reason that it was used? I called the founding pastor, which I was fortunate enough to be able to do, right? I'm talking to different people, talking to the elders. I had heard in the past, a previous minister had changed it, just kind of swapped it out, and there was a big uproar. And so that minister backed off and put it back in. So that told me that the process had not been a healthy process before, but that this had come up previously. And so I had to kind of do some investigation, some background work about where this problem is coming from, and that took time. Okay. I had to discover the history of it, the congregational approach to problem solving. Okay, so once I learned about how the affirmation, attempted replacement of the affirmation had gone many years ago, I started to ask people, how does this congregation historically, how has it engaged in problem solving? Right? Has it been by decree? Have we had learning and then conversation and voting? What has been the process? So I did talk to a lot of my folks who have more institutional memory than me. I've been here 8 years, to say, what have been sort of the processes that we've gone through? Again, it took time to have those conversations. Then once we identified that this was maybe an issue worth our energy, we had to decide who was going to take this on. Okay, so the elders, we have basically two groups here. We've got the board, which does sort of the business part of the church, and we have the elders, which are the spiritual leaders in the congregation. So we decided the spiritual leaders of the congregation were the group that should take initiative with this. So the elders, in their monthly meetings, took on a study, right? Took on some hard conversations around why the affirmation we have is problematic for people. And then we pulled out a bunch of hymnals and other resources and looked at various affirmations. We looked at the disciples affirmation that we have. Well, that felt kind of too long and involved. Maybe we wanted something more simple. And we went through a several month process of study. How does an affirmation function in worship? Why do we have an affirmation of faith? What is it supposed to do? What's essential that we say and what's not essential? How spacious does it need to be, right? I mean, we're asking and having all of these conversations over the course of many months. And then as a group, we drafted our own, rather than, this is a very disciples thing to do, by the way. Those of you who aren't disciples, we looked at all of the choices out there and said, we're going to write our own. So a couple of the elders took that on to draft something. They brought it back to the elders the next month, and we tweaked that a little bit until everyone could say yes to it. And then we put it into worship. All right, so all the time we're still saying the old one over many months, and then we implemented it for just a month And a month seems to be enough time for everyone in the congregation to have said it at least once. Our weekly people are saying it, 3-4 times. So they're getting a sense of how this new one feels to them theologically, how it fits in with worship, et cetera, et cetera. And then we ask for feedback, right? Again, that takes time as well. And then at some point, it was probably on kind of what I would call a festival Sunday, like a big one, maybe Pentecost or something. I don't remember for sure. We had a formal adoption of that affirmation of faith by the congregation. Okay, so beginning to end of the actual adaptive action process, we're talking 9 to 10 months for this one thing. So you're going to hear me say this a lot today. Adaptive action takes time. It takes a lot of time. Technical problems do not. Okay? They can be done pretty quickly and without a lot of feedback. But so this is an example of how we did one process of adaptive change. Okay? Okay, so we're going to wait with that one. So I'm going to ask questions and follow up. Anybody have questions?
So this is Sandy, and I wonder if you can just say quickly, it seems to me that you could have treated the affirmation of faith as a technical problem and just said, and maybe that's what the other pastor did. We have a problem, we're just going to change it. I'm going to decree that this is going to be done. But the reaction was, the reaction was such that you realized or could see this is more of an adaptive challenge, that this is more than just what words are we going to say in worship, but that there was a whole history to this and a whole theology behind this. And it just seems like we sometimes want to treat
Yes.
adaptive challenges as technical challenges.
We absolutely do. When an adaptive challenge comes up, our first impulse is to fix it with a technical fix, right? Because those are easier, they're quicker. We don't have to dig into a lot of the why. We don't have to have a lot of conversations. And that is what happened. Some people had expressed sort of not dissatisfaction, but that the theology of what they were saying didn't really resonate with the theology they felt in the congregation, right? So here's one of the ways we know we're in an adaptive moment. What we say and what we see happening, there's a gap, right? So we see that gap and go, wait a second, something's not connecting here. Why are we saying this, but actually we're seeing this? That tells you might be in an adaptive moment. And so I had heard about this and some other decision-making processes in the church over the course of several years being in this congregation, of how they had been on the edge of an adaptive moment. A technical fix was put in there and it didn't work. Okay, so that would be another indication to you. This problem has come up. We've tried the pastor just decreed it, or the leadership team just decreed, this is what we're doing now. And then people left, or people got angry, or, hey, look at that parking lot conversation, right? We all know the parking lot board meeting. That's going on. And now we've got this current of division, right? So those are all indicators to you that you have attempted to fix an adaptive challenge with a technical fix. Yeah, that's really good. Thanks for pointing that out.
Sarah?
Miriam, we're going to get to that in just a minute. So hold on to your question. Yes, I'm not sure who just said my name.
I did, Seisha did.
Oh, Seisha.
I'm wondering too that sometimes what I'm hearing as you explaining this adaptive challenge is that sometimes the problem is the failure of systems to be effective, or we're not recognizing the systems that are in place, and sometimes those are not healthy systems. And
yes,
that often gets
yes. Yeah, and we're going to talk about, before we close the morning, we're going to talk about some principles for healthy community. And I think that that's going to address that systemic issue too, is to say, systems in an organization, no system is completely isolated, right? So I think of, I really love living systems theory. If any of you are familiar with that, it's kind of a scientific theory, but in any organization is a living system, right? So the different parts of the system are interacting with each other like a body, right? Like my respiratory system and my whatever other systems I have in my body are constantly interacting. It might not be formal, it might be informal, right? When one of those systems goes awry, the whole system is affected. And we might be limping along for a long time before we decide to do something about it. But if there is something happening in one of the systems in the organization, it is going to affect everything else. Right.
Yeah, I just want to add to it, that just complicates, because now you're probably dealing with two adaptive challenges, your system as well as the presenting challenge.
Well, you can look at it as two separate issues, or you can say this is an adaptive challenge we have that affects this system and this system and this system in our organization. And so we're going to have to address maybe some technical fixes in all of those places, right? Oh, my feet hurt, so I can't, well, maybe I just need to get new shoes, right? And then so my feet won't hurt, and then my posture's better. And then, I mean, it could be as simple as that. But with an adaptive challenge, it is always going to affect more than one particular system. So our elders, for example, took on most of the work, but it wasn't an elder problem. Does that make sense? So we had just decided that the elders would take the initiative with that particular challenge. So yeah. Other questions? These are great.
Yeah, Lanny, go ahead.
Let me see if I'm.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I would just note that the second step that you talked about, needing to identify the root causes, or deciding who should take on who's doing the deciding on whether there's a problem or not. The people that are chosen to take on the challenge can affect whether there's a certain denial that goes along with it, or whether there's the solution, or whether the problem is something that needs really radical changes. So defining who defines the problem is very, very important. And how I love and I have to say I'm not a great historian about Lincoln, but Lincoln's choice of his cabinet when he, after he was elected with great controversy, to choose the people who ran against him as his cabinet, and basically throwing, it's a military thing, basically calling the mortar fire in on your own position, or not doing that, or
right.
choosing very conservative people to define the problem can be a problem in itself.
Right. And that's why whoever has the problem has to fix the problem, and you get to decide how you go about the fixing. Right. So if it's maybe your pastor who says, goes to someone else and says, hey, have you ever noticed we say this, but okay, so I'll use an example of being an open and affirming church. We say we're open and affirming, we went through the process, but we do not have a single person who is from the LGBTQ plus community in this congregation. There's a gap, right? And so whoever notices that goes to, and we're going to talk about this with leadership, but goes to an ally, right? You're not going to go to the person in your church who's toxic. You're not going to go to the person in the church who has for 6 years been saying the opposite of what you say. When you notice that, you're going to go to an ally first and say, hey, I just noticed this. Is this a thing? Right? And they'll say, yeah, I've thought about that before, and say, oh, I had a conversation with so-and-so about it. Well, then the three of you are going to have a conversation, right? And then you're going to test the waters a little bit to see if this is a congregation feel like this is a problem, right? And then, so as you start to unpack that gap, you start to discern who might be your partners in doing the work, right? And I'm just saying that from a pastor perspective, but that kind of leadership can come from anywhere in your organization. It could be from one of my youth who is starting to discern that they're identifying with that community, and then also saying, but nobody else here is like me. So there's a gap. Even though we say we're this, we're not embodying it. So that kind of leadership can come from anywhere. And then you start to, you step into the swamp, really, is what you're doing. And you see who's willing to go in there with you. Yeah. Good questions. Anyone else? Nope.
I don't see anyone else unmuted.
Okay. So we're going to go back into groups here for a few minutes. I think I'm staying up on this, the time. And so here's the question. So I think it was Miriam that asked about, the challenges of just doing worship. Okay. Don't talk about doing church. I just want you to talk about doing worship. Or if you're in a parachurch organization, you can maybe pick one thing that you're doing, right, that has changed during this COVID-19 restriction period. And just talk about what were or are your technical problems, right? Things that were easy to identify, easy to fix, short term, that kind of stuff. And adaptive challenges, things that might be ongoing, things maybe you haven't even quite figured out yet related to how you are worshiping. Okay. And we're going to take, let's say, since we're in smaller groups, I was anticipating 5. So let's take 8 minutes and we'll talk about that. And you can just select one person to then sort of list some things in the chat rather than sharing out verbally. That can take a long time. So try to get it concise and just share that in the chat when you come back. Okay. So Sandy, if you'll send us back into those breakout groups.
I'm opening the rooms now.
Awesome. Click on join when you see it. And we'll see you in 8 minutes. So add to the chat if you have a spokesperson or one person who's typing, or if you all want to type a little bit, what have been some of the technical problems you've been able to address quickly? What are some of
Oops.
The host muted me. It's okay. I think I'm back.
You're back.
Okay. What have been some of the more adaptive things that required new learning, things that required experimentation, that maybe weren't as easy to identify at the beginning? What are some of those things? Miriam asks, has the pandemic caused adaptive change to go quicker? I think because it was a forced adaptive moment, I think yes. We had to be adaptive and we didn't really have a choice. And so I think it has intensified the urgency congregations might be feeling about changes that might be permanent from this point forward. I know for our congregation, we're talking about, well, now that we have an online footprint, why would we not keep that going? And what does it mean to be online? Because we've never done that before. So what is our online presence? What does it look like? Who are we reaching? And those are more adaptive questions that flowed from this sort of forced change, right? So that's a really good question. Had to make adaptive changes, right? With little input from the congregation. Yes. So there were some technical, I would say even moving worship online is in many ways a technical problem. How do we still meet? Well, for me, it was, we're moving to Zoom. I already know Zoom. That's the easiest transition for me. We'll have a couple of sessions to teach people how to use it enough so they can be present in worship. And then, so that was in many ways for us, it might not have felt that way to you, but for us, that was kind of a technical problem. Not so adaptive. It would have been adaptive on the other end for people having to learn a new technology, right? How am I present in worship now? So yes. Some members don't have technical skills, not even email, right? So this is an adaptive challenge. How do we meet the needs of those people who don't have these quick technological fixes available to them, right? That's and we are still dealing with that. We just have a very small handful of people that are not meeting with us online. How do we make them feel as though they're part of the community, right? Without having to be on Zoom. Change communion to not cross-contaminate, right? So that, again, is a technical problem, I think, that most people would not have a problem with. Although we used a few of them here on Christmas Eve because we had 2 families present. That was it. But 2 families present. So we used the little cups, and there were a lot of complaints from the children about that nasty wafer in there. So so some of you may have heard that as well. Seating farther apart, wearing masks, no social events, right? Hybrid in-person, no singing. It's a hard one. Now that brings up a point too, that the decision to not sing may have just been a technical problem, right? It's not smart for us to do that. The state guidelines say we shouldn't, so we won't. I mean that, but there is a whole bag of emotions wrapped around that. And when we start to move to hybrid and online, like we're online now and we're singing by ourselves, but we're singing, right? When we have hybrid and we can't do that, what is that going to look like? So that becomes an adaptive challenge as well. Staying on top of the research around particles and how they spread, and all of that is a learning piece. Let's see, from Jennifer, adaptive challenges included deciding to not close our church. After all, how to keep personal connections, right? Learning new ways to do that. That's good. Right. So something that Anna is saying here, I want to make sure that I'm clear with the word adaptive. So changing something doesn't necessarily mean it's adaptive. So adapting our, now I'm not trying to push back, but I just want to lift this up. To change a microphone out because I need a condenser now is not an adaptive change. Now we are adapting our sound system to online, yes, but that's not necessarily an adaptive process. It needs to meet those criteria. I was the one who bought the microphone. I asked a professional which one I should get. You know, I ordered it and it's here. So that's technical. Okay, so I just want to be very careful about how we use the word adaptive. Adapting something to fit a different scenario is not necessarily an adaptive challenge. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Hopefully you're reading through some of these too. These are great. Congregation is strongly considering permanently streaming services for members. Yep. And so there's a whole constellation of learning things that have to go along with that. Right. Phone calls, right? So changing the way that we're doing pastoral care, that can feel adaptive. Learning about best practices, making sure we're connecting with nursing home communities to see what their guidelines are, right? So any place where you are learning, having to, in our Kirkland clergy group the other day, one of the ministers was saying she's had to do her own adaptive work because she's now on the, she's a pastor who's doing all the phone calls. She doesn't like talking on the phone. She's never really done that. How am I present to people in this format as opposed to face-to-face? You know, so that's her own personal adaptive work. That's not necessarily an adaptive change in the congregation, but she's having to unpack that for herself. All right, forcing us to face our denials and ask, what is the point of church? Well, that's just a little question, right? What's the point of church? Yeah, that's a big adaptive question. That was at the root of my dissertation, right? What does it even mean to be church? some deep soul searching, right? That's going to happen across the organization, hopefully. I'm going to give you a tool for hopefully doing some of that. Use of music on Zoom streaming. Yeah, that's, in my opinion, technical problem, not an adaptive change. You have to look at your licenses and say, well, we're going to buy this one, and that means we're singing these songs and not these. That's technical, because I don't have to get approval from the congregation to make that happen. We don't have to do any new learning necessarily. Changing how we do communion. Yeah, I mean, the communion issue, especially for disciples, is a big one because there's a lot of history. There's a lot of tradition around that we're having to come to grips with. Yeah. Revealing underlying questions, right? So again, the adaptive work is that stuff under the surface, right? We see this gap, and when we start asking questions, it leads to more questions. It doesn't lead to a solution, right? That's another way we know we're in an adaptive moment. Like, I keep asking this question, and then people just keep asking me more questions. Oh, well, hit the pause button and see what there's energy for, right? Yeah, keeping stewardship and giving active when people are used to doing it in person. That might be adaptive. I would tend to say that is more of a technical problem.
And this is
This
Sandy.
good. Yeah.
I was just going to jump in and say that the stewardship question, yeah, there's a technical solution to that. We can provide opportunities for online giving, but I think the adaptive shift may be in what is stewardship, and what does it mean to what is my responsibility in my practice of stewardship, as opposed to I give when there's an opportunity because I'm right there. You know,
right.
There's the deeper questions reveal the adaptive change, I think.
Exactly. And then to say, well, what does stewarding mean in this current context?
Right.
I can't go and show up at the food bank. I can't, what does it mean to steward our building when we're not in it? Those are the deeper questions. And some of those questions might reveal a particular way that you want to go, right? Well, now that we're not in our building, hey, maybe we should engage with this bigger question of, do we even need one? Right? So then that is an adaptive challenge, right? So that's a really good point, that some of the technical things, and again, that is that challenge between identifying a technical problem and an adaptive change. The technical problem might reveal something deeper, right? Very good. Awesome. You guys are great. Thank you so much. Let's see. Let me share my screen. Okay, I just have one more thing, I think, before we finish our morning time together, and hopefully I have enough time to, I may just kind of blast through this, and then if you want to ask questions about it after lunch, we could start there. These come from Margaret Wheatley, who is a very prominent figure in the area of organizational change. And so she does not come from a Christian perspective or even necessarily a church perspective. But I think, as I read these, she is on the nose with how churches function or could function. Okay, so I'm going to share these with you. And when she says healthy community, what I'm reading into this is a community that is adaptive, a community that is built to change, not one that is built to last. And by that, I mean be the same always and forever in every context. Okay, so first one, people support what they create. Okay, any of you that have been part of, in your current church or another church, of some kind of church transformation process that has been imposed from outside, and you just work that process, and then they come back and say, well, here are your 3 options. My experience of talking with churches that have done that is that they typically don't work, because the people didn't create it, right? You're going to support something that you create because you've invested time and energy and education and whatever around it. People act responsibly when they care, right? People have to care about whatever this adaptive challenge might be. Conversation. Sorry, conversation is the way human beings have always thought, right? Conversation is our least expensive transformational tool, right? To be in conversation with meaningful conversation with one another. So, and informal conversations are helpful, but formalizing conversations, how do we structure a particular conversation to get at the information we need? I'm going to share a tool with you this afternoon that is going to help you do that. So conversation is a big one. To change the conversation, change who is in it. If you feel like your leadership team is going around in circles, bring in more people from your congregation. If your decision-making team is all people who are 50 and older, get some youth in there. Yeah, it's going to change the conversation. And expect leaders to come from anywhere. This is formal and informal, and I was talking about this before. Adaptive leaders can come from anywhere within your organization, and you in a leadership position have to be open to that possibility. Okay. I'm not a pastor who sits in my ivory tower decreeing things. I don't think any of you are. We probably have all encountered someone like that, or a leader or a boss or whatever. Leaders have to be open to other ideas and other leadership coming from somewhere else, formal and informal. Focusing on what is working gives us energy and creativity. Okay, again, this is going to tap into the tool that I'm going to share with you this afternoon that is all about appreciating what is good. Appreciating what is good. That's where our energy comes from. If we are circling on, if we're just focusing on what is wrong, what are problems, we're going to have very little energy and creativity around that. There is wisdom in us, right? We need to tap into the wisdom that already exists in your congregation. People who might have experience with change in a completely other setting might have some wisdom to share about how the church is engaging in that. Everything is a failure in the middle. Okay, so we just, again, this is that swamp metaphor. You just have to be okay with that, of it being messy and maybe not looking like it's such a success when you're still in the middle. Humans can handle anything as long as we're together, right? You've got to get organizational buy-in across the organization. And this is also about just walking with us and what kind of presence we are with one another. And to always be operating out of generosity, forgiveness, and love. Those are principles as church people we can get behind, right? I'm going to leave that up for just a second. This will be coming to you, so you don't feel like you have to scribble it down really fast, or you can take a screenshot right now and you'll have it. But this will be coming to you as well. So I saw a post come up in the chat. I'm going to close this, and if we have any additional questions, yeah. Any of you have done any work with William Bridges' work with transitions know this too, that the middle is always a mess. And we just have to get comfortable with that. Yeah. Questions, thoughts, anything?
I am not seeing anyone unmuting.
Okay.
These are wonderful principles, and it's good to have them in front of us. We know these things, but we don't necessarily remember them.
Right. And when we're in the heat of an adaptive challenge, we might forget. Right. And so we need some guideposts to come back to say, okay, this feels like a disaster right now, but we're not at the end. So I'm just going to have to find a way to get comfortable with its messiness right now. Maybe I need to change who's in this conversation because we feel like we're circling the drain, right? So who else can I bring into this conversation that is already part of our organization who might have some wisdom to share, or at least ask different questions, right? Yeah, I saw somebody light up. Was it
Yeah,
you,
I
Sharon?
have a question, Kara.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with loss? You know, you face an adaptive challenge. You go through what you believe is a faithful process for dealing with that challenge, and you lose people.
Right. Well, and it's not even just losing people, but it's the loss that even the people that stick around might have, right? So Heifetz and Linsky, who are sort of my go-to people on adaptive change and adaptive leadership, say people don't fear change, they fear loss. If we do this change, what am I going to lose? Right? I might lose the person sitting next to me in the pew. That's a big one. I might lose the way that I thought church was supposed to be. I might lose my position of power that I might really like. I might have to get uncomfortable in church. So yeah, I mean, loss is a big thing, and you do have to deal with that. So I'm going to share one example from this congregation. When I first got here, the congregation, during the interim time, they had decided to do Journey of Discovery. Anybody else, show of hands, done Journey of Discovery? Okay. Journey of the Discovery might work in some congregations, but it wasn't working here. And when I got here, I sat down with one of the leaders of that process and I said, lay it all out for me. Let's see it. Where are you at? What are you doing? What have been the processes? Has anybody left? Right? All those questions. And then as I'd been here a few months, I was just like, these people are grieving. And I don't know what that's about. I just knew intuitively that there was grief in this organization. So it was small conversations with my secretary and others. They were still grieving their move from their church in Totem Lake 2 years before. Right? And so it was the state came in, took over the property, booted them out of this church that they had started and built, right? They were well compensated, but that doesn't make up for the grief, right? And then they came here and they got busy with the work of making changes to this church and moving in, and then their pastor left and they got an interim and they jumped into this process. And I said, we're ending this early. We're going to have a little burial for Journey of Discovery. And we're just going to be together for a while. So any plans I had for any change, they went on the way back burner, right? Because we had to deal with our grief first. So grief is powerful, powerful stuff. You've got to deal with it. And so when you start talking about, we're going to be open and affirming, you've got to deal with grief people have. Grief people have parents of kids who are in the LGBT community who have felt like they couldn't share their whole self, people who may have been harmed by the church. You have to deal with people who are having to really dig into their theology. There's going to be a lot of grief there. How you deal with it? I mean, I can't give you a formula because it's too contextual, but those of you who know how to do good grief care, that's what you do. You can't force people to get over it. That's a really good question, Sharon. Thank you for bringing that up because it's so important. Technical problems will not cause grief. That's another one you can pay attention to. Toilet's jammed, fix it. Nobody's crying over that, right? We now have an online way that you can give your monthly giving instead of writing a check. Nobody's going to have grief about that. Yeah. So there's another sign. Any other questions?
I have a question. I think when they're, excuse me.
Oh, Rosemary, go ahead.
Yeah, this Rosemary. I think when there's technical, let's see, what was I thinking? I think people often focus on the technical changes when there's the deeper grief. I'm thinking about when
Sure.
University Christian moved in with Lake City, the complaints came up about the way they did communion, the way they, all kinds of things. So
Right.
you look at, there's the underlying grief that's being expressed through the technical complaints about technical things. That's very good.
Right. Right. And that's really insightful, right? Because those of us who have either been in grief or know people who are grieving know that that grief shows up in all kinds of ways, right? And sometimes just being busy makes us, I mean, it's a way of soothing ourselves, right? Of not wallowing in whatever our feelings are, but I'm going to go get busy over here. And yeah, and so insightful and empathic leaders can see what's going on, right? I had a professor who used to say, the problem's not the problem, right? So whatever that problem is that's manifesting, then ask another question, and you maybe ask another question, and you might get to it.
I have a question.
Margaret?
Yeah, Margaret.
Hi, where does the fitting in, or is there a fitting in of honoring what is good? Sometimes when we do all this stuff and then we don't take time to breathe and honor it and
Right.
recognize it, we just get lost up in the project, whatever a technical.
Right. And so that's an important piece of what Margaret Wheatley says about healthy congregations, that they lift up what is good, right? And we're going to get into this in the afternoon in the process of appreciative inquiry, which is a tool that you can use tomorrow in your congregation. It's a great tool, which asks the question of, what do we love about this organization? Right now or in the past? When were we really being who we wanted to be? Right. And you're asking this from an appreciative perspective, not identifying problems, because as we know, most people are going to know what the problem is, right? I mean, if it's a big enough one. So it's asking in an appreciative perspective, what is good about what we're doing, have done, the history of this organization, before we start getting into the weeds of what could change. Who do we want to be, in the future? And then there's your adaptive opportunities. Yeah, but that's essential, is you have to name what's really good. It's really good. Yeah. Marvin.
Kara, would you talk about, so often it seems to me when we get a group together to do something, we tend to get the people that already agree. And I've heard, it's good when you get a group together to work on a problem, to include some of the people who are the minority viewpoint from the very beginning in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak to that?
Yeah, in the afternoon when I talk about what adaptive leadership is, we're going to get into that. Who are the people that you need around you? And one of those groups is, you've got to know your opposition, right? And I think it's a leadership decision how much they're included in the process, right? Because there could be someone who is a part of the opposition who's going to undercut everything you say at every meeting. Should they be part of the team that's leading the change? In my opinion, no. Should you know what their opinions are? Sure. And create a way for them to feel heard. Maybe it's just you and the opposition having coffee once a week. Should be really uncomfortable. But maybe that's it, rather than inviting the opposition to be part of a team that's going to do the adaptive change, if they're just going to be constantly undercutting what that team is wanting to accomplish. So yes, and there are going to be, in every change initiative, every adaptive action, there are going to be the majority of people who are sitting back and waiting to see what happens. Right? They're not actively opposing what's going on, but they're not quite sure we should be doing that. So they're going to wait and see how it goes. So we'll talk about these different kinds of folks you need around you if you want to be an effective adaptive leader. Yeah. Good question. I love you guys are asking questions of things I'm already going to talk about. Really good questions. Well, I think we're at our time. And so I want to make sure you have a nice long break to continue to process, get some food, get a little fresh air, and we'll be back here right at 12:30. Is that right, Sandy?
Yep, 12:30 Pacific. This room will remain open if you want to share lunch together. I'm going to step away and get something to eat and then come back, but you know, feel free to stay and visit. We'll stop recording. And if you want to just step away for the hour, that's great. We'll be back at 12:30 Pacific time.
For 1 hour, right?
1 hour.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Move around a little bit. Before I dive into this afternoon's topic, I just want to open it up to any questions that occurred to you maybe during lunch, anything that you want to circle back around to from the morning. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody asking a question, so I guess we'll just move right on. Sandy, if you are ready to record, I'm gonna share my screen here again. Give me just a second to get that going. So this afternoon, we're talking about leadership in adaptive change. How do we do it? What are the pitfalls? And I'll do a little bit of resourcing for you too. I've also pulled a few books off my shelf during lunch so I can show you. I know some of us are more visual learners than we are oral through our ears. And so I'm going to show you what they look like, although there's no guarantee because there could be a new edition or something that looks differently. But at least you can kind of see what they look like if you're if visual imprinting works better for you. So getting into adaptive leadership. Heifetz and Linsky say in their book, Adaptive Leadership, that to lead is to live dangerously.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll dig into what they mean by that here, but this is one of my favorite cartoons. Anybody who's been on a search committee or a new pastor, right? Well, we're hoping you'll lead us on a journey of transformation without requiring any real changes, right?
Yes.
We've all been in that meeting. So, so I want to share with you some truths about adaptive leadership. And these come from these two books. These are by Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. They're Harvard business people who are really at the leading edge of adaptive change and leadership and adaptive change. So one of them is really sort of about leadership on the line, is about adaptive change and leadership, and has lots and lots of stories in it about how they've seen that. Yay, Seisha, you get gold stars. And adaptive leadership is more of a tool. So you can go into it. They've got questions about, boy, I'm on the balcony. What questions should I be asking myself? So this is a more practical resource book. This is more just describing and sharing stories about. So I think they work well together, actually.
Also about, is that also from Heifetz and Linsky, or
Is what?
is
The
that
second one?
Heifetz and Linsky?
Yes. Yes. Both Heifetz and Linsky. So, okay. So getting into some of these truths about leadership. Authority and leadership are not the same thing. Okay. Authority is what gives me the power to make decisions, to enact particular things. It's sort of the expert on a particular topic. It can be formal or informal. So for example, as pastor of a church, I have particular authority over certain things. Certainly not everything in the organization, but a lot of things. There is also that matriarch of the congregation who has a lot of informal authority, right? To affect things maybe more behind the scenes. Somebody that people listen to and will act on what they say. Leadership is a little bit different. Leadership is more about leading people into chaos, right? Asking deep questions, not just giving answers. Okay, so when they talk about leadership being dangerous, that's what it means. It's you're in there and poking and prodding around in places where people, the authorities, might not want you to start doing that. Okay. People will respond to adaptive action with fear. If we do that, what about this? Right? We can't do that because we've all heard the, well, we don't do it that way. Okay, those are all kind of rooted in fear of change, fear of loss. So there can be a lot of fear at play in your adaptive challenges. We talked about this earlier. You're going to have to address loss and grief. There's no way around it. Can't ignore it, because then it will become toxic in your organization. Some people in your organization will attempt to thwart your leadership, formally or informally. So we probably all know the story of the pastor who was hired because of XYZ, and then that pastor pushed in this direction, and then they got fired, right? So not in disciples, right? But other so this can happen formally or in those sort of informal email chains. I fell into this trap really badly in my last church where I was music director, and I sent out an email with a particular change to things, and I was not someone who sat at a desk all day with my email open, and by the evening when I went back, everything was imploding, right? So so that can happen in any number of ways. Just know that it's going to happen. You'll have to operate within and above the fray, right? So you're going to have to be down there in it. This is called the dance floor, right? I'm out there, I'm with everybody, I'm participating. And then every once in a while, you have to remove yourself from the fray. And Heifetz and Linsky call this the balcony. You've got to get up to the balcony and take a bigger view. Because when you're on the dance floor, you might not be able to see what's happening over there. So you've got to remove yourself, take some time, look at what else is happening, show up maybe to another group's meeting, whatever the balcony is. You've got to remove yourself from what is happening on the ground and just get sort of the bird's eye view. You have to be continually asking questions. Clarifying questions, probing questions, deep questions. That is your primary posture as an adaptive leader, right? Now, if you're an authority or if you're authoritarian in your approach to leadership, you don't have to ask any questions. You just do what you want to do, right? So if you are in adaptive leadership posture, you must be always asking questions. And you may not be able to see all the questions that need to be asked. This again is where if you want the conversation to change, you change who's in the conversation. Get another person in and say, what are you noticing, right? That will be really helpful. I love this. This comes from the Heifetz and Linsky, but also from Sharon Delos Parks, who I would recommend to you as well on this topic. Leadership is an art, and there is an improvisational quality to it, adaptive leadership. You cannot write out your agenda and work that agenda to the T and assume that things will work out the way you want them to on the end. Okay, you have to be willing to sort of change as you go. And it's not a set of hard and fast rules. There's some interpretive, artistic elements to this kind of leadership. You have to rely on allies. So if you are in an organization, you probably have a short list. It's not going to be a huge list of people, a short list of people who are your allies, who when you go to them and you pose a question, they're going to tell you the truth, right? If you want to do some kind of initiative, they're probably going to default to be on your side, right? These are your allies. You have to also know the opposition, right? And so it's Heifetz and Linsky who suggest going to coffee once a week with the person who is your biggest opposer, right? That's the folks or the person who, when you float an idea, the first thing out of their mouth is, we can't do that because, okay? And then you have to court the uncommitted, all right? This happens through education, through social opportunities where you're just, engaging them with some questions in a more conversational way, informal. You have to probably describe more of your intent to this group than to your allies, right? They need a little bit more from you, and you have to kind of win them over to your side. Okay, so you're going to have those 3 groups of people if you're engaging in adaptive leadership. And the uncommitted are the largest group. You have to be a person of integrity, right? You have to practice what you preach, and you have to name your own responsibility in the problem. Okay? If you are not honest about that, you're not going to get anywhere. And as leaders, as pastors, we're not always right. We may make, when I mentioned this little email explosion at my last position, I had to, the next time we got together, I had to own it that I handled that badly. That my initial email was probably not worded as well as it could have been. Or perhaps I should not have done it in email at all and should have waited till we were together, right? So you have to own your own part in that. And whatever you're asking your congregation, your leaders to do, you've got to be willing to do the same thing. You have to figure out ways to manage whatever conflict comes up, because whenever you get into the weeds of adaptive change and any kind of adaptive actions you're going to try to create to affect that change, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflict. All right. I know we are conflict allergic in the church, but there is no way around it. The only way through is in, right? This is the swamp. So there's going to be conflict. There's going to be people that don't want to do it. There's going to be people who are actively trying to shoot it down, right? So you, as the adaptive leader, have to figure out when it's time to turn up the heat or turn down the heat. Heifetz and Linsky talk about a crucible, like your challenge, your adaptive challenge is in this crucible. And you've got to figure out when to kind of turn up the heat, when to lean into the conflict, and when maybe you just all need to take a step back and let it cool back down. Okay. What I mentioned earlier about the journey of discovery with my congregation, we were at a place of deciding, are we going to turn up the heat on this and really dive into it? Are we just going to turn the heat way down and just kind of not talk about it for a while? So that was one of those ways that we tried to manage the conflict between people who wanted to stick with it, people who thought it never was a good idea from the beginning, people who were indifferent to it, right? You had to manage all of that. So you manage that through different containers and then turning up the temperature. So by containers, I mean places where you're engaging the conflict, right? Is this a conflict where maybe we should just have a conversation, small conversations? Are we going to create the container of a survey to get feedback, right? Are we going to isolate this just to the leadership team or the board and really turn up the heat right now on this? Or whatever those containers are for the conflict. Maybe it's one-on-one. Maybe that's the container. Yeah, Seisha.
I've got a question here about the need to perhaps, sometimes there is enormous pressure to want to cool it down, but that's really a symptom of wanting to avoid the whole thing.
Sure.
Can you address a little bit about sometimes it's just one or two people as the leaders who are saying, no, we really need to keep up the heat up on this because it's too easy to just avoid it when actually we're getting very, very close to the truth of something.
Right, right. Because the urge to cool it down is we're getting close to something big here, and I have fear about it, right? So there's that fear thing raising its head again. I mean, this is it's hard for me to say exactly what to do because again, this is that part, that artful improvisation, right? Is you have to have enough tools in your toolkit to be able to discern, right? What is this really about? And maybe the cool down, enough of the cool down is to say, it's getting heated in here. Let's take 5 minutes and then we'll come back. Right? What kind of container are you working with? Or are we going to just set this process aside for 2 months and then come? That's turning it down too much, right? So you as the adaptive leader have to decide what kind of temperature is going to keep us in it, but not bring it to the crisis point, right? Because once you're in crisis, people start walking away, and you don't want to get there, right? I tell my congregation very often to say, we're going to start talking about this now because it's not a crisis yet. Okay, budget, whatever, staffing. I mean, I want us to have a plan together. So when we start to sense the temperatures going up, we already know kind of where we're going to go with this, who's going to stick with it, right? Because once you're in the crisis, really your only choice is to turn down the heat. So I don't know if that is helpful to you or not, but it's so contextual. It's hard for me to just say, here's the rule. Because
I think maybe what I'm sensing is something that we all like to stay away from is that we're not able to name our fear.
Right.
And sometimes I think that needs to become an element of adaptive leadership too, is to be able to lovingly confront one another and say, what is the fear here that's really going on? And sometimes we don't know how to name those.
Right. I think you're right. And how you set up the norms of your container make a difference. How you, one of the things that I have done in the past when I'm working with the congregation is at the very beginning, I've done this in board meetings too, when I know there's a big decision. At the very beginning, I will give everyone a couple of minutes just to write on a slip of paper, what is going to get in the way? What are you bringing in here that is going to be an impediment? What fear do you have? Anonymously, just to write them down. And then we'll engage in prayer, and I'll read every one of them. So that protects people a little bit, but also names all the stuff that's in the room and invites the Spirit into that, right? And I think that's really helpful to say it's not just about how I'm feeling. We're in this organization together. We can hold each other's angers or fears or whatever. We invite the Spirit into that in a prayerful way. And then when something flares up, maybe we're not as surprised, right? Because that can be an issue too when you're in the context of leading some change, and all of a sudden it feels like something just goes nuts over here in the organization. You're like, where is that even coming from? So creating a culture where you are having these conversations on a regular basis, right? Where you're talking about things that are meaningful and not just, what you did this last week in the context of church. I think that's helpful. Really good question. Okay. This is key as an adaptive leader to place the work where it belongs. You have to figure out who has to do the work. You cannot do it alone. You cannot. Anything that is dependent on one person is not sustainable. And adaptive change is a long-term process. So if you as the pastor, or you as the chairperson, or you as the whatever your title might be or position might be, if you're the only one doing it, it will not be sustainable. You have to put the work on the people who need to work out the solution to the change. And that may be several places in your organization. It could be that one team takes the lead, and then as they make decisions, then they connect with whatever other team they might need to for conversation. I had a professor in seminary who said, you can run something up the flagpole, but if nobody salutes, you got to bring it back down. And it's really important because I think especially those of us who are sort of solo pastors in smaller congregations feel like we've got to be initiating and doing all this work. And you can't do it. You can't do it by yourself. And if you do it by yourself, there won't be the buy-in in the congregation, right? Remember Margaret Wheatley, people support what they create. So they have to create the change, not just the pastor. And then, of course, you've got to stay humble. Manage your hungers. What they mean by this is whatever you are hungry for. I'm hungry for this congregation to be more missional. I'm hungry for us to have more diversity in our congregation. I'm hungry for whatever. You have to manage that, right? You can't force those things to come to fruition. You may have to look outside your organization to satisfy some of your hungers, right? One of the things that I always struggle with as a pastor is where can I go and feel I'm having a worshipful experience? It doesn't always happen when I'm leading worship, right? So where can I go? Or maybe spiritually, I just need a sounding board. Maybe I need a spiritual director, right? To help me process. So, and then anchoring yourself, right? You have to have a place that is sanctuary, that is not the organization. You've got to have people supporting you. And you have to feel anchored in your own identity, right? Like what do I uniquely provide here? That's not what I have to be doing 110% of the time, right? Have your creative outlets, whatever those might be. Okay. I know that's a lot of information, so I want to pause here and open it up to any other questions. I'm going to stop my sharing for a moment and see if anything else has come up.
It feels a lot like tap dancing while you're patting your head and rubbing your stomach. Multitasking, yeah?
Yeah, there's just a lot to think about when it comes to adaptive leadership. But I wouldn't want to equate it with that necessarily personally, because multitasking can create, can damage leaders, right? If you have too many things going on. I know there's a lot to hold in what does it mean to be an adaptive leader, but and I think for me, it's something that I just come back to. It's like I come back to it and say, okay, where am I blowing it right now? Right? Oh, I'm not letting the people do the work, right? I'm trying to, it may be well-intentioned, but I'm doing more work than I should be doing in this situation. So I need to step back a little bit. Yeah.
I think there's a great section in the adaptive leadership book that talks about how do we as leaders get in the way of adaptive change. And I've just found that really helpful to go back and reread because our fears can get in the way.
Yep.
Our leadership styles can get in the way. Our need to get things done can get in the way. So it's really good to be kind of asking, how am I getting in the way? Because it's really easy for us to see how others are getting in the way of change.
Yeah. That's true. And if you don't feel like you have leaders stepping up, then that's a point of reflection, right? All of our organization, I think everybody's organization that's here has very few paid members and mostly volunteer leadership, right? And so am I training people to be leaders? Am I creating opportunities? Am I paying attention to someone's giftedness and inviting them into that? One of the things we decided here a few years ago was that we would not fill one of our board positions in our bylaws if we didn't have anyone gifted for that who could do it. And so that has meant over the course of a few years, we don't have an evangelism chair, right? That's in our bylaws. I can feel however I feel about it, but we haven't had that filled. We didn't have an outreach person for a while because the people uniquely gifted for that weren't able to do it. And so there's a certain amount of improvisational flexibility in our organization, right? This is becoming the Built to Change church that protects our volunteer leadership. Because we all know when you plug somebody into a hole that has to be plugged because we have the hole, you're going to burn out your leaders. Yeah, so, you know. Any other questions? All right, everybody good? You having your post-lunch drowsy time? We can do some calisthenics if we need to. That's why I'm at my standing desk today, because it helps me to have more energy. Okay, all right. I'll go back to sharing my screen then. So I'm going to invite you to think about a leader that you know, an adaptive leader, someone who has led in change, a season of change, significant, if you can think of that. It doesn't have to be the pastor or the CEO or whatever, somebody who was a leader. And I want you to enter into the chat 1 or 2 words that describes that leadership style, not the person necessarily, but what was good about their leadership, or maybe you had a terrible experience of adaptive leadership, what might not have worked. Okay, so I'm going to start reading a few of these out. Positive reframing, asked great questions, thoughtful, flexibility, open-minded, communicates often and well, a good listener, who validated the input of each person, always ready to do anything, open and invitational. I like that word, Sharon. Thank you. Invitational. Positive, celebrating victories. Oh, so important. Mm-hmm. Celebrating victories, big and small. Kept the process going. Compassionate. Says no way. Did I say that right, Mary? Got their hands dirty. Impatient, not so good. Impatient. Taking enough time for listening. Yeah, let me go back because somebody said something I don't think I've mentioned here. All right, Mary, I don't know if this is what you meant, but an adaptive leader tells the truth, right? There's an element of the prophetic in an adaptive leader, wherever they're coming from in the organization, is they just tell the truth about what is. And there is, so if we think about prophetic qualities, you know, we think about people who are telling the truth, they're outspoken, they seem to have a sense of, they know what's going on. They're pretty grounded people. And they also, how do I want to say this? they tell the truth, but they do it in a way that people can hear it, right? Because you can't just be shouting the truth. Presence matters, right? How you show up matters. So there's a really wonderful book. I don't think this is in the resource I'm going to send you, but it's worth looking at. And it comes from someone, I think, who used to work at Google. It is called, why can't I think of the name of it? It's Radical Candor. That's the name of it. Radical Candor. And I see some people shaking their heads. Maybe you've read it. She approaches how we interact as leaders from this particular rubric of, and she says radical candor is the most effective way to communicate with people. You can't be too nice. You also can't be mean about it. You can't be someone who sort of couches things so people don't get offended, right? Remember that quote, that leadership is dangerous, right? You're poking the bear sometimes. And so, yeah, just the ability to tell the truth. I remember a particular time in my congregation a few years back when, and this was an attempt at a technical fix to an adaptive problem. Remember exactly the circumstances, but I just had to tell a couple of my beloved older congregants who suggested a fix to something, which was something we did 35 years ago in my church and I had to say, that will not work. And I just had to say it. And it sort of felt kind of harsh, but parenting doesn't look the way it looked 35 years ago. And so I just had to name that, to say, I appreciate, right? I appreciate that was meaningful to you and that it worked when you were in your 40s. But I'm telling you, as a mom in her 40s now, that will not work. And so we had enough trust in that particular container to be able to just hear it, right? So sometimes you just got to tell the truth. All right. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on to something else? Something related but different. Okay. Sorry, I can't see everybody, so. Okay, so here we go. Okay, this is from Heifetz. To practice leadership, and he means specifically adaptive leadership, you need to accept that you are in the business of generating chaos, confusion, and conflict. Because that's what will happen. And from Romans, right? Be happy in your hope, stand your ground when you're in trouble, devote yourself to prayer. I think both of these things describe adaptive leaders. You've got to be grounded. You have to stand your ground. You have to have done enough work to know that where you're standing is where you should be standing, right? But always hope with hope, always with hope. Okay, how do we do it? Oh, I don't know what happened to part of my thing. Okay, here it is. This is Sharon De Los Parks. It's not the alligators that keep us out of the swamp. The mosquitoes are enough, right? Does that resonate with anybody? So you have to figure out, in your position of adaptive leader, what is the purpose deep enough, compelling enough, necessary enough to get us into the swamp? Okay. That's an important discernment for an adaptive leader. All right. Then once you've identified that purpose, that thing, then how do we, this is Peter Steinke, how do we carry the congregation or organization across the threshold of can't? Because that's always going to be the first thing that comes up from your opposition. We can't do that because. All right, so how are you going to get the congregation across that threshold? Peter Steinke's book will be in the list of resources I send you. So here's one way, okay? One way. And I do want to name that adaptive change is highly contextual. All right. I think this is part of the reason that a lot of the models that we pay for and get a consultant don't work as well as maybe we hoped they would, is that whatever your organization's situation is, you can't just go out there and say, well, that organization did that and we're going to do that here, right? It's highly contextual. So you've got to be doing your own work. The people with the problem have to figure it out, right? And you have to be asking questions that are specific to you. So I'm recommending kind of this process. Take this for what it's worth. Congregational identity work is important, right? What is the purpose deep enough to get into the swamp? Who are we now? Right? Not who were we 20 years ago. Who are we now? Who is in the room? Who is showing up? What does our neighborhood look like? Right? And then getting to some of that through this process of appreciative inquiry, which I'm going to describe, and then moving into adaptive action, which is here is what we're going to do. And I have a resource for that as well. So this is Margaret Wheatley. All change, even very large and powerful change, begins when a few people start talking with one another about something they really care about. I think this is true. I think there's a Margaret Mead quote too about small numbers of people being the only ones who really affect change, right? Doesn't take a lot of people to get on board. I was listening to something recently talking about social change, right? And saying that really you only need, I want to say 3% of the population to be out there actively advocating for the change, which seems like completely unreasonable. But I think this is true. When a few people start really asking the right questions, what happens can be really powerful. So this is appreciative inquiry. There are different versions of this. So I'm going to say, if you go to Google and you type in appreciative inquiry, you're going to get 10 different resources on how to do appreciative inquiry. This is the one that I like the best. But you don't have to like it the best. You can find another one that works for you. I like things that are easy to remember, that have mnemonic devices. So the 4D cycle works for me. I just have to remember what the 4D words are, right? But the first one is, okay, so in the center where it says affirmative topic choice, that seems weird. This is the thing that you're focusing on, right? Are we going to talk about congregational identity? Are we going to talk about what we love about our church? Great conversation. What do we love about our church? This gets back to that celebrating victories, right? Having that appreciative lens, not focusing on the problems. So whatever that topic choice, it could be if you're in an adaptive change cycle, you're looking at open and affirming, right? You're looking at becoming a green chalice church. You're looking at whatever the thing might be. So that affirmative topic choice is the thing we're going to talk about. First step is discovery, right? Appreciating whatever it is about that thing in the center. So let's say it's our congregation. What is life-giving in our congregation? And everybody gets to share their response, right? What is life-giving? What is the best thing about this congregation and our life together? So we're just appreciating things, right? The next step then is to dream. What might be? What kind of organization could we be, right? What is the world calling us to be? So envisioning the possibilities, right? Dreaming. And it's really important when you're in this step not to judge any of it, just to get it out, get it on paper, make a list. If I turn my camera around, you can see my giant Post-it notes that I have. We'd started doing some of this work before we shut down the church on a particular topic. But I've got my list, right, that I can pull back out the next time that we're together to have this kind of conversation. So dreaming. Then the next step is, okay, where do we want to go next, right? Design. Here's our dream out here. Let's pick these two things. And let's think about what could be the ideal of our congregation becoming that, right? What might it look like? So we're constructing something. And then we get to the deed of destiny. How do we do it, right? How do we create something that will last long term? How do we empower and learn and adjust in our organization to become that? Right. And then once that's been going for a while, you start back at discovery. So there's always a reflection on, okay, here's where we are. Here's what we could be. We're going to try to do this. Here's how we're going to implement it. And then you start back at the top. What did we learn? What do we know about ourselves now? Right. So it's this constant cycle of appreciative inquiry, always focusing on the best of your organization. Doesn't mean that we're not ever going to talk about what went wrong, but we're going to position ourselves into not, boy, that was a disaster, but what did we learn from that failure? Right? What did we learn about ourselves? What did we learn about our neighborhood that we can then carry into the next cycle of this conversation? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second and show you a book. Dun, dun, dun. This is the best resource I have found. It is called Memories, Hopes, and Conversations. It is by an author named Markell Branson. This will be on your list if you don't want to write it down right now. You can see by my Post-it notes, it's one that I use regularly. This is a great resource for congregations specifically of how to do appreciative inquiry. And he describes the process in a congregation that he was part of, but he also lays out the steps of how to do it, right? So one of the things that he says is with appreciative inquiry conversations, you want to train a small group of people to be able to lead these kinds of conversations and then sort of deploy them to have the conversations and bring the information back. So you've got a core group of people who have some training in how to facilitate this process. So you can't just like drop it into a Sunday morning. You can't just send it out to your women's group and assume they're going to do it properly, right? You need to have this kind of structured and trained process. Okay, conversation is great. Informal conversation is great, but when you want to really talk about a specific thing like appreciative inquiry invites you to do, you need some people who are trained in the process. It's not hard. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to hire someone to train you. It is all right here. So for the $13.99 or whatever you spend on the book, you've got your elders or whatever group you want to invite into this. You've got your elders training for the year, right? So it's super helpful. And I'm just naming my elders because that's sort of a built-in group that we have that I could train. But it could be volunteer. It could be seeking people out that are good at managing groups, right? However you want to structure it. But then you'll go and have the conversations and they'll come back. And then you'll tweak the conversation. You'll go back out and have more conversation and bring the information back. So you are creating an organizational culture that talks about hard things, that provides space for everybody to share, and that is all focusing on what is going well and right and what's working in your organization. And you could set up, I have done appreciative inquiry, not in a large group, no. I've done it with my congregation, though, with small group leaders. Does that make sense? Is that answering your question, Mary? So I have trained a small group of people to go and have the same conversation.
I've been in large groups where someone else led it in a large group. And I'm curious why you choose to do it in small groups.
Because people will talk more freely.
Okay.
So when you get into a large group, and I've seen this happen actually, you get into a large group and you're trying to do appreciative inquiry. This is probably some social science thing, but someone will chime in with something that, and here's your gap, right? Here's the gap you're looking for. They'll say something that other people disagree with, and the group will shut them down. They'll say, oh, we're such a welcoming congregation. We do this and this and this. And someone will stand up and say, well, actually, when my brother came, he felt like nobody talked to him. Oh, well, and then excuse, right? So you may have someone who has something to share that would be disruptive to the prevailing narrative. If they're in a small group, they're more likely to share that and more likely to be heard than if it's in the context of a large group. So even I've used appreciative inquiry in what I would say a larger than normal group doing a retreat with a congregation, but I broke them into pairs and then had them report back, right? So the more intimate the container, here I'm going to use that word again, the more intimate the container, the more people are going to share. And you think about all the introverts, right? Raise your hand if you're an introvert. I know you don't want to. All the introverts, the bigger the gathering, the less likely the introverts are to talk. And not to overcharacterize it, but your introverts are some of your deepest thinkers, your most thoughtful, reflective people. And you want to hear what they have to say, but they might need a little more time and a few less people around to process.
That was a process in Journey of Discovery, and it was done in a huge group.
Yeah. As an extreme introvert, I am very aware of how the introverts are feeling about large group sharing. And so, yeah, if you just pay attention to how large group sharing goes in your organization, it's always going to be the extroverts who are talking first. It's not good or bad. It's just the way it is.
So Kara, I have a question about the 4 Ds and circling through that process. And when you're starting with affirmations, which I really like appreciative inquiry too, but there's a temptation to idealize about what I appreciate. And then when you get to the deciding what are we going to, what are the projects we're going to work on, or what are we going to do out of that's new or fresh, how do you keep them from devolving into the should? I'll give an example. I went to a church that had done some long range planning, and in their long range plan, and I inherited this long range plan. So in this long range plan, they were going to start a daycare center in the building. There was no one that really was committed to starting a daycare center in the building. But through this process and thinking about what do we do best? Well, we love children best, and that's really a strength of ours. And look, we have this resource at the building. We should start a daycare center. So there was the should in there, but they were stuck on that. We said we should do this, and no one wants to do it. And so they didn't do it. So, I mean, I guess that piece of realism.
Right. Well, realism's the bugger, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be some aspirational aspects, but I think this kind of conversation in conjunction with other adaptive change tools, I think is really helpful. So one of the things I'm not going to talk about today, even though I really would like to, because it's an amazing tool, is asset mapping. So let me see if I can quickly pull my book here from my shelf. This is partially why I'm here. Okay. This book called The Power of Asset Mapping. It is by Luther K. Snow. Again, this is a book you can purchase from Alban Institute, I think is the first person that first group that published. You can purchase and you can learn and train people how to do it in your organization. You don't need to hire someone to come in and do asset mapping with you, although I'd be happy to do that with anyone. But part of my passion about this is equipping small congregations or organizations that don't have huge budgets for transformation to be able to do it yourself, right? So asset mapping And there's another book I'll put on the list by, I can't remember his name, Eric Law, which is really helpful in thinking about what is it exactly that we're stewarding, right? So if you're going to plan to do something, to do the asset map is helpful to say, yes, we have a building. Yes, we love children. Who's going to do it? Because again, you can have a great idea, you can run it up the flagpole, but if nobody salutes, not a good idea for your organization, right? So, so that's an important element of, I think using some of these tools together. If you've got a particular adaptive change you're trying to address, I think you probably need a leadership team. You can't have one person figuring it out, and you can't have the whole congregation trying to figure it out. That's too many cooks in the kitchen, right? So you've got to have some kind of team, a container for them to be doing some of this discernment work. Yeah, that'd be great. Did anybody ask the parents around in the neighborhood if they need a daycare? That's another question. So as the adaptive leader, again, you're always asking the questions. And I find myself doing this even in board meetings, right? So we might be thinking about, how am I going to use this just kind of day to day in a board meeting? Someone will say, let's do this. Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, well, and then I always ask, I'm the gadfly, who's going to do it? Because the default, pastors, is that you're going to do it, right? Mm-hmm. You're the professional Christian around here. You're going to do it. Well, no. My plate is full. Thank you very much. Who's going to do it? And then that invites more questions. All right, so what exactly is involved? All right, what's our next step? And who's going to do that? And then when do we want them to report back to the board? And et cetera, right? So there can be a lot of aspirational things offered, but you have to ask the question of who's going to do it and where we're expecting the work to get done and what that's going to look like. So the appreciative inquiry model doesn't necessarily make suggestions about that piece. It's just really a tool for having really well-structured conversations. So then your team, when they come back and you start unpacking everything, that's when you start asking more questions. And then you can take that back, say, hey, this appreciative inquiry gathering is going to be about the preschool. What do we think is great about that idea? What could it look like? And then you get to what needs to happen to implement. And that might be where you start to go, oh, well, maybe it's not such a great idea, right? So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I will say too, as long as I have the book out, asset mapping is tremendous way for congregations to start thinking about things they wouldn't normally think of as assets, like your relational connections, your own particular gifts, things you can do that your congregation might not know you can do, right? So it starts thinking about not just the physical things you have or the amount of money in your bank account, but thinking about assets in a more holistic way. And what do we have available to us that maybe isn't something that's tangible, but is still an asset, right? So for an organization like KIN, I'm going to call on my neighbors and friends, is all of the relationships you have are tremendous assets. I know that you know that, but those are incredible assets, right? Any kind of relationships you have outside your church building or organization are probably untapped assets. Okay. Great. Do we need to take a little break? I know it's afternoon time. This would be a good place to take a little 5-minute. Or no? No? What time are we ending?
2.
Probably not a good time to stop. Okay, 2 o'clock, right?
Right.
Okay, I better keep going. Okay, so so that's appreciative inquiry. And then I'm just presenting this to you as something else to think about. This is an adaptive action cycle. And I love this one because, again, it's so simple. It's what, so what, and now what. Okay, so the what is, for an adaptive leader, what patterns am I noticing, right? With our affirmation of faith. I'm noticing this pattern of people who are guests here don't come to communion. or don't say this affirmation with us. What's that about? Okay, that's the thing that I'm noticing, the pattern. And then I start asking myself questions about that. So what does that pattern mean? Right? And then the now what is, then what can I do to shape the patterns moving forward? And this is what's called an iterative cycle. So you can have this over and over and over and over. What? It's this thing. So what does that mean? What are we going to do now? And then you start again with the what. Okay, we tried to implement that. Here's what we noticed. What could we do differently? Cycle starts again. Okay. So this is a pattern that invites you to be continually adaptive. And again, it takes time. You need people who are committed to the process. It could be a small group. It could be your nursery workers. It could be your Sunday school teachers. It could be any group that's wanting to just start paying attention to patterns and doing something about that, right? Becoming a built to change organization. That is from, I'm going to show you another book. That is from, well, it's from a group called Human Systems Dynamics Institute, which sounds very unchurchy because it is. But their website, hsdinstitute.org, has so many resources right at your fingertips for free about how to do this adaptive action cycle. They also have trainings and blogs and webinars and all kinds of other stuff. And then the leaders of that organization wrote this book called Adaptive Action, Leveraging Uncertainty in Your Organization. This is a fairly, I would say, more academically toned book. This is written by a teacher, so it reads differently. The website again is hsdinstitute.org. And you could just type that in and save it for later, but it will take you a long time to get around all the pieces of their website. But they're so generous. They even have like weekly, you can sign up to be part of a weekly discussion group about adaptive change and organizational dynamics and things like that. I'm all about equipping congregations to be able to do this themselves at a very low cost, if you haven't noticed that yet. So I love that. Again, there's lots of different models of adaptive change cycles. I like this one because it's simple and easy to remember. What, so what, now what? Which really gets at, I'm very pragmatic, so it just gets at. Doing this during COVID, you can still do it. You just have to do it online. I mean, I've already been thinking about how can I continue this appreciative conversation that actually had started with my board, since we're not going to be able to meet in person for another long while, probably. Taking this conversation online. And as long as you have people who can manage the technology, there's no reason you can't. The one thing that you might miss, particularly with people that you don't know as well, is the body language piece, right? Those of us, many people who are leaders of churches or whatever, are fairly empathic, and we have a sense of the room, right? We can sort of have a feeling of the energy of the room. I find that I miss some of that online. But if you have a group, I know for you particularly, Miriam, you've never been able to meet in person with most of your people. So that adds another layer of challenge to it. But if I would say start with your allies. If you've got allies now, start with them and see if they would be interested in holding some of these conversations themselves, you know, and then divide up people into small groups. And then those small groups will get to know each other after a while. Make it a regularly occurring thing. Every month, we're going to have a appreciative conversation. You can come up with a marketable name for it. I'm terrible at that kind of thing, so I don't even try, but like Second Saturdays or whatever you want to call it. I'm just try to get some buy-in. Okay, we're almost there, folks. Oh, I'm so delighted you're all hanging in there. This has been a long day. So this is just about your, again, leadership posture, adaptive leadership posture. You have to know your stuff, but you also have to remain open. right? I am not the authority on everything, and I do not ever claim to be, nor do I want to be. I don't have that kind of time. So this is my particular gift and role in this situation. I'm always looking for other people who have gifts that I don't have. You have to get comfortable with ambiguity and vulnerability, right? You have to hold questions. You cannot force resolutions of questions. Ask questions more than you give answers. This is, again, the difference between leadership, adaptive leadership, and authority. Some things I'm the authority on, and I act in that way. But when it comes to adaptive change, you have to always be asking more questions. Turn your judgment into curiosity, right? Don't have the first thing out of your mouth go, we can't do that because. It's like, well, what would have to happen for that to occur, right? So turn to curiosity. Turn disagreements into mutual exploration, right? Learning more about whatever topic together. And then turn your defensiveness into self-reflection. I said this at the beginning, right? When the going gets tough, turn to wonder. Why am I having such an emotional reaction to that? And then do your own self-reflection. Always great to have a spiritual director or a spiritual coach. I've had both of those in the past and find them equally beneficial for different reasons. So yeah.
Annette had a question in the
Oh, okay.
About
Yeah.
how to move from chaos to discussing change. And Annette, I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Well, it just seems like in my particular congregation, we focus so much on the chaos that's happening around us that we don't get past that. And so I wondered if you had some tools to suggest to us to get past the focusing on all the things that are going wrong. We have acknowledged some things going right, but we seem to still get mired down in the chaos of existing versus having the change happen. So that was my question.
Right. So are you talking about chaos in your organization or all the chaos out there in the world?
Within the church.
Within the church. Yeah, I mean, creating some of these structured opportunities to focus on what is good, I think would be helpful. It becomes, at some level, a spiritual practice, right? We all know what's wrong. You know, have you seen those commercials? I think they're for insurance or something, and it's like, oh, when you start to become your parents, and there's a guy. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And one of the things is like they're all standing together, and someone with blue hair walks by, right? And the guy goes, "We all see it. We all see it, right? We all see it. Okay, we all know what's wrong, for the most part, right? People who are invested in the organization, we know what's wrong. But now we're going to focus on what we love about this congregation, what's going well. And whoever is trained to do those conversations has to be willing to nip the chaos in the bud. I mean, I hear you, but we're not focusing on that right now. And it just becomes a practice of focusing on the good, right? And maybe there's a way that you can kind of, one of the things that I like to do just for myself when I'm in a meeting, might be helpful in other meetings, I haven't tried it, is to create a parking lot for my other thoughts. Okay, so on my little paper where I'm taking notes, I draw a little square. And anything that's unrelated to what I'm supposed to be focusing on goes in that parking lot. Because it's something that has come to the surface because we have to at some point pay attention to it, but not right now, right? So this is actually a practice from Sybil Macbeth from Praying in Color, that we all have these things that come up, but the focus of our conversation right now is this. And so that's going in the parking lot. So it may be a way of just acknowledging, yeah, we all know that's a problem. We're going to put it over here. Right now, we're going to be focusing on appreciating the positives of what is right now. And so again, that's one of those improvisational things of leadership, of leading that kind of conversation, acknowledging without dwelling on. I don't know if I can be any more specific than that, but if you do want to follow up in conversation, please just email me and we can talk about it more in depth. That's just what's coming to me in the moment. So.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. I love this quote, Robert Stephen Reed. I'm going to put this article in your resources list. The contemporary challenge for the church, for congregations actually, is not just to identify ways to implement change, but to create congregations that are continuously adaptive. This is a culture shift in our congregations, and shifts in culture take a lot of work. So I just want you to know that it is going to be a long-term commitment to becoming that. And as a professor of mine said, not everybody left Egypt, right? Not everybody is interested in doing the long work. So wandering in the swamp for a while. So just know that. It doesn't invalidate what you want to do as an adaptive leader. Are there any other questions? I can put all my contact information here too if you want. My husband and I have this Kairos Counseling and Wellness website together. My information is not complete, so it's not there yet, but eventually it will be. But you can always reach me at my email. I have my own Facebook page if you want to go there too. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'll include that in my resource stuff that I send you to. Is there anything else? Let's see, I see a chat just popped up. Behind the scenes deals. Yeah. I mean, again, that's a cultural thing. You have to become a culture where conversations are, you're trying to have them in the open. Again, it's hard for me to say anything super specific because every context is different. I don't know the history of those behind the scenes deal making, but that might be worth some energy, right? Is it always the same people that are engaging in that kind of thing? You may just approach one of them and say, we had the opportunity in the board meeting for you to speak up, but you didn't. Can we talk about that? I mean, you're just going to have hard conversations with people at some point. And know that conflict is part of being an adaptive leader. You can be a pastor and not engage in adaptive leadership and never have conflict. Well, I don't know if that's true, but never deal with conflict, right? I mean, we've all been part of organizations too that there's conflict happening and nobody's dealing with it. That is a highly toxic environment for everybody. So maybe one of the things you discern is that our congregational leadership needs a conflict management class. Maybe we should all take that together or read a book together about it or something like that. So Sharon, such a good question. So Sharon asked if you're not in the chat. Let me pull that back up. She says, as people of faith, what helps us to ground our conversations about change in the future to being faithful to God's unexpected call? This is where preaching and worship and Bible study are going to be useful for you. Saying prayers like the one I opened with on a regular basis. I found in my research that disciples have an extremely low sense of a theology of the Spirit and what the Spirit is and how the Spirit works. So maybe you decide, or you and your pastor together decide, you're going to do a Bible study and focus on the Spirit, right? The Spirit is the chaos maker, the fire bringer, the creative energy, the thing that binds us together. I mean, there's so much in there about what Spirit is and does. And I think it's the Spirit that gets us across the threshold of can't in a leap of faith. We just have to trust the Spirit. But if we don't have any language for that, I think it's hard for us to imagine it or rely on it. So this is one of the pieces in my dissertation that we really need, particularly disciples, but maybe other churches too, really need to focus on this idea of Spirit and how Spirit is active in the life of the church now. And I don't have any specific resources to do that, but I think it's one. I think for me, when I look at particular texts, when we're not looking at a Sunday where we've just had a major crisis, where I want to focus on that, I bring an adaptive lens to my Bible reading, right? Looking for stories that are adaptive. I mentioned Moses and the people going into the desert. I mean, if you need an image, a biblical image for adaptive change, that's it. Exodus. Do a study on Exodus, right? When is Jesus being adaptive? Why did Jesus throw those tables over, right? Seems pretty out of character. There's a gap, right? So getting some of the language and stuff, and even in a particular way of reading the Bible that has an adaptive lens. It's not the lens I always use, but certainly it's there occasionally. Yeah. So there's some ideas, but I think the more you get this in front of people, the more they're going to start understanding the language, thinking in adaptive ways. So whatever containers you have available to you, use them appropriately, but use them. Yeah. Anything else? This has been so great. Such good questions. Doing that pretty well. Read the Bible through a hermeneutic of adaptive change. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Can anybody think of another adaptive story? I have so much in my brain right now. All the prophetic stuff is going to be great for adaptive.
All the parables.
Parables.
Parables are.
Yeah. So anytime you can bring it into the conversation, I say do it. Oh, there's another chat.
Death
Sorry.
and resurrection.
Resurrection's an adaptive moment for sure. And I don't have a particular resource for you on sort of a hermeneutic of adaptive change. That would be a really interesting thing to look into. If there are any books out there, my guess is there might not be. So there's the book that someone needs to write. Just want to make sure I'm seeing all the questions, if there's any other questions.
As I'm thinking about this through adaptive change, where do we see that? The entire Bible is about adaptive change and about what God is doing to help us through the adaptive changes that we wound up creating for ourselves. I mean, the whole story of salvation is adaptive change, or the whole story of redemption is adaptive change.
Yeah, it is tricky. I'm going back to Kendra. I think that maybe you sent this to me privately, so I don't know if you want me to read this out or not. How do you get your team to be open to doing some of these things, right? Well, here's where having a little authority is not a bad thing, right? I just tell my board we're going to do a book study. I mean, there's no grades. It's not like if they don't read it, they're going to get kicked off the board or anything. But it does make sure that in our board meetings, we're setting aside a certain amount of time to talk about the last chapter. We did a book called Slow Church together not long ago. The New Parish, what was that called? Was it just called The New Parish? That was one we did. We didn't do one last year because there was enough going on in the life of the church. But moving into this year, yeah, I've got a new board president. We're already talking about what kind of study we're going to do. So Canoeing the Mountains is a great book. This again will be on the resource list. Some of you I know have already done it. A pretty recent book, 2015 did that come out? Something like that. So it's pretty on the nose about adaptive change and how to lead in that. So yeah, I mean, just at some point you have to lean on the authority that you do have to say, we just need to do this. And like I said, you'll have people that don't want to, you'll have people that will actively try to oppose it. Most people will participate with a wait and see attitude. And then you'll have those 5 people who have just been waiting 6 months for you to say that thing, right? Those are your allies. So that becomes your core group of people that you know you can go to when you feel like you want to throw in the towel as a leader.
So I just added another question on there, like how,
Okay.
So we've had a lot of change in the last year in our church, and we are without a pastor. And our interim pastor left. And I feel like our church is kind of divided in that where we're at right now is not where some of the people wanted us to be.
Uh-huh.
So the outcome, the result is not what they wanted. And for some of us, it is what we wanted. And so we're trying to, I mean, it's a small group of people. We all have to get on the same page to be able to lead this church. How can we come together? I mean, all of this really helps, but we have to start at a starting point where we can all agree we need to talk about it to move forward. So how do we even get to that point where we can say, let's talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, that might be worth a further conversation for you and I to talk about some things more specifically, but I would say, you know, if you can start having some of these conversations, if you can create a container for that, that's great. If you know those people, if you feel comfortable, if you're the leader, whatever formal or informal leadership you have, use that. And if you're on one side and someone else is on the other, you know, you might be small enough where you can just say, you know, let's just have a conversation. Maybe they'll commit to having a conversation every 2 weeks. That is appreciative in nature, right? So you could purchase this book and read about, or I don't know, I don't think Markell has a website, but look at some of these tools that he provides in here of how to structure that kind of conversation, and you can be having that conversation without telling the other person you're doing it. You know what I mean? I mean, not everything has to be laid out for everybody. So, and I think, and I agree with Margaret Wheatley on this 100%, that conversation is our greatest tool. And having conversations with people we're in conflict with is hard. But that's what adaptive leaders do. And so if you can commit to that, or you and your allies can commit to that, I think there's probably a lot that maybe needs to be unpacked. Maybe people aren't feeling like their feelings are really being heard. That was something that happened here early on in my tenure with this church, was that there was a complaint, didn't come to me, of course, circled around. Finally, someone else brought it to me. And then I said, this is a board issue. So we're going to talk about it in the board. We're going to talk about it in the elders separately. And we're going to figure out a path forward. And it ended up being creating a survey, calling every person in the congregation, not me, but lay people, calling everyone in the congregation, bringing all that information back together, sorting through the data, right? Looking for patterns. And then we came up with a plan for moving forward. And it was a long process. I mean, we're talking a couple months at least, right? Oh, that's a great question. What about the bullies? Yeah, what about the bullies? These are your opponents. I mean, these are the people actively working against what you're trying to do. So I think now, if I'm wrong about this, Sandy, help me, because I know you've read a lot of, or Seisha, you've read a lot of adaptive leadership stuff too. You don't give your energy to the things that are not moving you forward. Right? And that can be hard to do because bullies tend to be high needs people who are trying to get your attention or demand your attention or whatever it might be. And it becomes difficult. Now, I will say I taught junior high before I became a pastor, so I got really good at not listening. So, yeah. That's a tricky one. You have to do what works for your own personality and leadership style, I think. But I do not provide the container for bullies. They might create their own container, but I don't provide it. And if they want to talk to me, let's talk. I'm okay with having conversations about conflict. Not everybody is. Maybe there's a container that exists. Maybe it's the PRC at your church. I know this person is actively opposing me. Let's convene the PRC and talk about it. Right? And if you don't have a functioning PRC, that's at the top of your list tomorrow, pastors. Because they're there to protect you too. So find a container where you could have some kind of, I don't want to say confrontation, that's not the right word, but a conversation about what's happening. I don't know. I don't know your bullies, so it's hard to say or how toxic they are.
Kara, you said if I had anything to say on that, and I do with adaptive challenge, is often bullies don't know they're bullies. They're just used to the way they have always done it. And when you get someone that challenges them, they don't understand.
Right. Right. And they may have informal power that they're not reflective about. Yeah. For whatever reason. Again, this comes back to that more prophetic element of adaptive leaders, just to name things. I've had conversations where someone has, this isn't bullying necessarily, but more about inappropriate questions for female pastors that they would never ask a male pastor. Do you know what I mean? And I've had the occasion to say, you're not allowed to ask me that, and I'm not answering it. I mean, how is he going to know otherwise? Obviously has gotten away with asking that kind of question of other women. So, and I just had to draw a line. And it didn't feel good, right? Nobody wants to have to correct someone who's older than them, or, you know, but that is part of that prophetic thing of just tell the truth, right? Stand your ground, right? And do it in as pastoral way as possible. I didn't get mad or yell or whatever. I just said, it's not okay. You can't ask me that. And
I think this goes back again to a much deeper issue of the reason bullies are often able to continue to operate is because it has become a system that has adopted itself to an unhealthy way. And then not only do you have to lift up what the bully is doing, but you have to kind of lift up to everyone else then that they've allowed this to be.
Sure. And I think, you know, maybe another Saturday we should talk about healthy systems and congregations, which is affiliated with what we're talking about, but, you know, its own thing in itself. And yeah. I mean, there is a level of, oh, he's just like that. And I call that church nice, and it's usually almost 100% not a healthy thing. So yeah, I mean, it's part of adaptive leadership is disrupting old patterns, right? Noticing a pattern, asking questions about it, and disrupting it if you have to. Again, conflict, chaos, confusion. Yeah. And then you have to, again, I mean, all of it applies. When do I turn up the heat and when do I turn it down? Right? All of those things. Once you kind of get into an adaptive leadership mindset, you've got this lens that you're like, that you'll be kind of viewing most of the work that you're doing through. And it'll kind of become second nature for you. So hopefully.
I want to share how true that is, Kara, just from our own experience as we are in the process of becoming Journey Christian. You will have conflict and it will be difficult and it will be painful. But what I have noticed is when you get a few people who start to get glimmers of what it means to be adaptive and change. Like Margaret Wheatley said, it just takes a few.
Mhm.
And then you do, it's like that bell curve of you get your early adopters, your
Mhm.
and then it begins to progress. But it definitely takes time, and it is not going to be easy.
Right.
And so I think it's almost from the beginning, if you can commit to that understanding, saying, you know what, it's going to get downright ugly sometimes, but let's commit that we're in this to find our way through it.
Right. And I think grounding our identity, particularly churches, grounding our identity in what is this thing called church that we're even trying to do, right? To always come back to that. Who are we as a church? I love Michael Kinnaman's description of disciples never just pick up their marbles and go home. Like if we're a unity movement, we do the hard work, right? So always coming back to your identity. That's why I listed that first in that sort of continuum of adaptive processes, is to say, get to know who you are and what you care about. And when a couple of years in here, what we did is we sat down and we did that work. And then we said, okay, here's the list of organizations that we support, or we say we do, or we have historically. I mean, 30 some whatever organizations. Who are we now, right? We don't have 200 people, right? We got 50, so we can't do 35 things. And let's just tell the truth about that. And let's really focus on what are the groups that connect with who we are as a congregation? What do we want to support? Where do we want our money or time or whatever going towards? And we narrowed that list down to 8, and we can really care about those things then. So getting really clear about who you are now, not who you were 10 years ago, or who Journey was and who University was, or who Lake City was and University was. Now you're not that anymore. So who are we now? Not that history doesn't matter. It does. And we appreciate that, and we bring the good stuff forward. But the challenge we had here was we were still thinking about ourselves the way we were the church in Totem Lake. We're not that anymore. So yeah.
I think
that helps, because if you're going to wade into the swamp, you got to know what's worth going in there for. Yeah. Somebody else started to talk. Sorry.
Sandy, this is Sandy. And I was just going to say, I think that's really key. I put that in the chat. The who are we now, not who were we or who do we wish we are. But really, really honestly, who are we now? And I think that's going to be an adaptive question as our congregations come back to worshiping in person. That who we are now may not be who we were when we left our buildings. For some of our churches going on 10 months ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's going to be a new challenge for us. And the temptation will be to boomerang back to who we were, or at least to pretending we can boomerang.
Because it's easier. Right. It's easier. Yeah. I do want to name that it is 2:00, and if you need to go, great. If you want to stick around for a few minutes, I can do that. There is a survey link, although someone said it doesn't work.
I will try it.
So I don't know if other people are experiencing that as well.
Okay, let me try it again. Okay, well, it just worked.
If it doesn't work, we can send it to you with other materials.
Yeah, it just worked for me. So let me put it in there again.
Okay.
Yeah.
That just helps our transformation team know what worked, what didn't, what suggestions for next time. So thank you so much. Please reach out to me if you have additional questions or other things. I'm happy to try to help if I can. And I'll stick around here if anybody wants to ask questions, not in front of the whole group. But
thanks so much.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for your attention. It's been really wonderful.
Excellent.